Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have everyone here with us today. This is really an important topic, as we all know. Today's presenter is Kevon Dean. I've had the pleasure of working with Kevon. He's the Director of Emergency Preparedness for Atlanta's Paradise Island Resort and Casino. I had the pleasure of working with him for 10 years as we were both part of the tourism industry disaster readiness and response team for the country, the Bahamas. We've been through, I think, more storms than we care to remember, and each one of them brings some lessons learned and improvements to the protocol, procedures, and so on, both at a destination level and at a property level. So we're really pleased to have a resource like Kevon with us today. One thing's always clear, that every year we need to go over the basics, checklists, team engagement. The devil really is in the details and keeping things front and center in our mind. And Kevon does just that year-round for the region, for the region's largest resort, and one of the largest resorts in the world, Atlantis. Now, I think we need to be clear, though, that the things that we're going to cover today don't necessarily, you can't just say that, well, oh, that's a giant resort and they can handle these things a little differently than we can. We're going to discuss the fundamentals and the practical steps that he and his team undertake, which are relevant to all properties, regardless of the size. So without me further speaking, let's go to Kevon and let's move on. Welcome.
Good morning. Good morning, and thanks, Frank. Thanks, Adriana. What a great introduction. And good morning, Caribbean associates and families all over the Caribbean. As Frank said, we're going to be talking about CHTA Storm Preparation Series, Proactive Property Protection. And so Frank's gone through most of this information, and I won't spend a whole lot of time with it, recapping my background. You'll be able to see that in the presentation. But let's go ahead and jump right in to proactive property protection. Before we get started, I would like to ask if you would give me some type of digital indication by raising your hand. What types of accommodations do we have in the audience, those that are dialed in? If you have 0 to 100 rooms, would you digitally raise your hand for me?
You could raise your hand by hitting that little hand icon. There you go, right next to your name. Perfect. We have 1, 2, 3. Ooh, we have a bunch. Okay. We have a good amount.
Okay. And how about 100 to 500 rooms?
Okay, a little less.
Okay. And then over 500 rooms. Anyone in the audience with over 500 rooms?
Looks like 3.
3, okay. And then how many of you actually have tenants, or you have rental facilities on your hotel property?
We have 3 hands up so far.
All right. And how about do you have or operate a conference center or a casino?
Okay, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know. And then here's the magic question. How many of you actually have a documented hurricane plan?
Oh, lots of hands in the air. Okay, thank goodness.
Excellent. Excellent.
1,
The
2,
presentation
3.
is now concluded. No, I'm just kidding.
About 11 to 12 people.
Great. And then how many of you have been impacted by a hurricane event in the last 3 years? Because I know we're covering the Caribbean, and it's a wide range.
We have about 5, 6.
All right,
Ooh,
great.
no more.
More, okay.
Let's give them a second to raise their hands. Is that it, guys? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 10.
Okay, great, great. And so I just kind of wanted to get a feel for what the audience was out there, and then we'll certainly try and touch on points, as Frank said, that is comprehensive in scope, that everyone would be able to benefit from the discussion or from the information that's shared. And so let's see if we can get right into it. So we want to talk a little bit about the hurricane season, which most of us or all of us are aware of, sometimes a little bit more painfully when we approach June 1st, and how to prepare. I'll also talk a little bit about 4 phases of emergency management. In addition, a couple of key things that's important is to understand leadership during a crisis event, as well as teamwork. And then I'll have a few little tips on before, during, and after the storm, things that you might want to consider, and then some helpful support documents that you may or may not have in your existing plans if you have a plan already. Okay. So of course, we're in the hurricane season this year. June 1st through November 30th is the official hurricane season. If I'm not mistaken, for the last couple of years, we've actually had storms outside of that window early. We've even had storms that have been later than that. We've already had Alberto in the Atlantic Basin on May 25th. So we started to see a lot of these anomalies happen again before the season actually officially starts and even after. So planning is very important. I also put the different categories, which I think most of us are very familiar with, but just as a refresher, the different categories of storms, because our response plans will probably react differently depending on the conditions or the intensity of the storm. There are a lot of factors that go into how we may need to respond in our plan based on the levels or categories of a storm. Other conditions also play a factor in that. Of course, is a storm moving very quickly, which direction it's coming from, how much precipitation or rain or water that it's impacting with it. So there are a lot of different variables, not just straightforward, we have a category 1, 2, or 3 that plays into how we prepare. I put this slide in here just as an understanding or refresher that storms go through series of watches and warnings, and the conditions may vary. In fact, there is also alerts that they've been starting to come out about 60 hours in advance. And so the unique thing about storms or hurricanes or tropical events and cyclones is that we do have some advance warning, and we do have notification on what the conditions can be or what we should be experiencing during certain times. That's very important because sometimes we may not feel that condition right away. We may wait too late to actually activate certain aspects of our plans. And so one thing as you're developing a plan you may want to consider is phased activations of the plan based on these watches and warnings, okay? So how do we prepare? You know, while we must understand that it is impossible to predict or plan for every type of conceivable event that could happen in a storm, a hurricane response plan is very, very important to have so that you can have the basics that needs to occur. It is usually a moving target on what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. And I know we spend a lot of time worrying about really what is the predictions of this season, which I think are 12, 7, and 3. 12 events, 7 named storms, 3 that could be majors in the Atlantic Basin. However, it only takes one storm And each storm is uniquely different. Even if they travel the same general pathway, each one will have a different impact. But having said that, it is important to have your foundational plan in place so that you know how to respond. Again, hurricanes are unique events, and fortunately, they allow us time to prepare. But they also bring other types of weather conditions that could be impactful. Water spouts, tornado activities that don't allow us as much time to prepare or to respond. So that's very important to keep in mind. The key is really to have a plan. So I was encouraged that most of us had indicated that we already have a documented plan. You know, a lot of organizations may only rely on their other emergency plans, but it's important, in my opinion, that you have a specific plan to deal with hurricane emergencies or weather anomalies. And of course, the most important thing I think is great. Plans are great, but execution is what really counts. And if we don't test our plans and test our processes, we could find ourselves in an event and not knowing really how to respond and trying to interpret the plan. So a plan document shouldn't be one of those documents that actually sits on the shelf until you actually need it. You need to go through those plans and review them with personnel, because sometimes your personnel change, your property changes, and so that's very important. And so developing a hurricane emergency response plan, which we'll call HERP, H-E-R-P for short, the goal is to ensure that you have comprehensive plans, processes, and procedures in place to respond to hurricanes, and by default, other emergencies. And I put that other emergencies in there because a lot of times what happens is you have a hurricane, but the other emergency is, for instance, a power outage, extended power outage, or even a fire or a medical emergency. And so your plan needs to incorporate all of these different types of emergencies within the framework of a hurricane response plan. It also should identify some key roles and responsibilities of organizations and teams. The reason is a lot of times, depending on the size of your organization and depending on the magnitude of the storm, you may have individuals operating and doing things outside of their traditional roles. And so it is important that we know who and how decisions are made, because in a crisis situation, you're going to have to make critical decisions very quickly, and you need a process that has been tested to make those decisions. The Hurricane Emergency Response Plan also seeks to respond, as I said, to basic emergencies. So there is a way to approach that, 4 phases of emergency management, and you can test each one of your plans through that. So I just wanted to take a little bit of time to talk through these four phases, which is mitigation, prevention, planning, response, and recovery. And so when we look at mitigation, I'll walk through this fairly quickly. Mitigation is the action of reducing the severity, seriousness, or painfulness of something, whatever that is. But when you look at prevention, and these two are in the first step, it is the action of stopping something from happening. And so as you're looking at your facility, you need to determine what things you can mitigate, basically reduce the severity, and what things you might need to eliminate, because if the event impacts that, it's going to be detrimental to your operations. So I gave a little example here about a room that may be susceptible to flooding. A precaution may be simply just to sandbag it or restrict the water intrusion. So that's a mitigating strategy. However, a prevention strategy might be to totally eliminate the contents of that room and relocate it somewhere else because it's that critical. And so you need to, as you're going through your operations, going through your facilities, no matter how big you are or how small you are, look at where you can mitigate or where you may need to prevent. And that's going to help to complement your plan and the action items that you need to move forward. Then is the planning process, thinking about the activities required to achieve what the end result is. For most of us, well, for all of us, I mean, human safety is the number one, and then obviously property safety is probably number two. So what do you have to do to ensure that if you have an event that's going to happen, a hurricane event, to limit the impacts or eliminate the impacts of that event? So ensure that you stage the appropriate assets in advance. Ensure that you have human resources support before, during, and after. And this is why initially when I said and explained the different processes or phases of a plan and the alerts, watches, and warnings, you want to know exactly what you need to do in varying areas of your organization, large or small, prior to. And then you have the response phase. You're in the storm, and how do you actually respond? How quickly and effectively we can react to changes in circumstances or situations. As the storm moves through, depending on its severity, it's going to change the conditions that you're in. And you will have no control over that, but you do have a control over how you respond. So make sure you have, again, the right complement of volunteers in the right roles and doing the right thing. One thing that's vitally important, has nothing to necessarily do with infrastructure or how many sandbags you have or how much plywood you have, is really communication. Communicating to your associates or your employees, communicating to your guests as frequently and as accurately as you possibly can. Okay? I can't stress that enough. You really can control the impact in a situation and the anxiety that people may feel, if it's guests or employees, by having clear, constant communication. And then you have the recovery. The recovery phase is the action required to return to normal state, which is the end result of where we all want to get to. And so as the storm goes through, it's putting your facility and your individuals, your employees, your associates, and your guests through very stressful situations. And you want to take the time to fully access the readiness of your property and staff it appropriately. Okay? And so the work that you do outside of the season will, on your facility, and the training you do with your staff and with your organization, will greatly enhance your recovery. And so you want to have the right team in place. And so one of those important team members is a crisis manager. And I mean, here at the Atlantis Resort, we have an individual that could fill that role primarily. You may be sharing roles, but it's important to identify who that person really is. It could be the CEO, it could be a general manager, it could be any number of persons, but it is important that you understand who that person is that has the overall responsibility for the plan. A couple of key points that they will be looking at is developing and maintaining the written hurricane emergency response plans. So a lot of times your plan gets developed, like I said, and it goes on a shelf and no one looks at it. It's important that that person's key role is to manage that plan and make any necessary revisions. They are responsible for integrating that plan into existing general emergency plans covering your building or work area that's being occupied. Again, remember I had mentioned before the importance of making sure that all of your other plans are up to date as well, because hurricane emergencies also creates conditions that will cause you to have to react to medical emergencies, fire emergencies, power emergencies, etc. They also will be responsible for training designated employees in emergency response. And so making sure that you have enough first responders or first aid CPR, or looking at what your vulnerabilities are. You may even need to have a physician on site, depending on your guest complement and other factors. So that person looks at the plan and looks at the conditions and say, okay, what other emergencies can happen, and are we prepared for those other emergencies under a stressful condition like a hurricane event, okay? They also should be ensuring that your facility meets all the necessary codes, because again, a storm will put your facility and your personnel under significant stress, and you want to make sure that you take the time on the front end so that you can improve your recovery on the back end. They would also look at and oversee policy and process revisions or creations. There are things that you have in place that are policies for the organization that are standalone policies that may or may not apply under hurricane conditions. And so we have here at our resort some compensation policies, some restricted area policies, and so they need to look and see if there are any confusions there with what you normally do. Because remember, people will gravitate to what they normally do, but a hurricane situation is a separate event that requires you to respond and react differently. So you want to make sure that you're within the guidelines of your policy. Of course, this is a lot for one person to do, and it is not normally may not be intended for just one person to do it. So you need to also have a crisis management team, or consider having a crisis management team. That doesn't necessarily mean bodies, but I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. But the crisis management team is comprised of designated departmental representatives. Now, one person may be representing 2 or 3 departments. But the important thing here is that you get the input and feedback from every area of your organization. A hurricane event does not only affect the front office. It does not only affect the building envelope itself. It's going to affect your booking. It's going to affect your public relations. It's going to affect your various other aspects of your operation, okay? So you want to, the crisis management team it gives you that feedback from all those different areas, and it gives you an opportunity to test the plan again and at various steps of implementation to improve the response, and of course to shorten the recovery time. It is important that this team of individuals, or the functions that we'll discuss, feed information back into the crisis manager, okay? And to assist with the overall execution of the plan. So I put this little success plan for success requirement is really teamwork. And you'll see a number of different areas or departments or divisions. Again, they may be one person doing multiple functions depending on your size. But it's important to understand that each one of these feed into the crisis manager and into the overall plan. So you have food and beverage, you have public relations, you have finance, and how you're going to deal with money. Someone said that that they're operating a convention center or a casino. And so obviously you need to know how we're going to secure the money, how we're going to move it from point A to point B, what happens if there's a breach, etc. And you need that input from the experts that do it on a daily basis and how they would be impacted. So here's some key things about before the storm that you might want to consider. And of course, this may vary by location. It may vary by operation. So I just jotted down a few. Review your country plan in relation to your company plan, okay? Most countries would have an emergency response plan, if not all. And you want to make sure you're complementing that, because there are things that the country or the government may do that may impact your policies and procedures. Establish effective communications plan. That's very key. effective to your employees, effective to the guests that you may shelter if you're in that condition that you're going to shelter on your facility, and then the message out to the world, because we live in a digital world and information is available in nanoseconds. And so it's important to understand who speaks and what they speak. You may want to consider a video or photo inventory of your property prior to the storm. I know that's one thing that we do, so we understand exactly what condition everything is in, from top to bottom, from the roof, aerial shots, or even and still. I'll skip through some of these. Test all of your emergency equipment and review critical parts, supplies, water, battery, portable generators, etc. You know, you don't want to get into an emergency situation and find out you don't have enough batteries. All of us are in the Caribbean, and most of us don't produce a lot of these support supplies, and so we want to have the proper inventory of items here in advance, and we want to test our systems so that they're available for us. Little things like raising any electrical or valuable items off the floor, turning off and unplugging things that could create other habits. Again, you want to limit the amount of other emergencies that could result from a hurricane event. Power down your computer, backup files, critical files, both paper files or electronic files, if you can digitize things to make sure that you have those records as you come out of your recovery phase. Retrain volunteers to ensure that they understand the roles and the responsibilities that they are being asked to do. Again, you may have persons that are volunteering, and they may be volunteering in different areas that they're not usually volunteering in. So you always want to have constant training. I'd go ahead and probably establish an emergency operating center, some location that is a strategic location that you can bring information into and send information out of. And so as you're reviewing your facility and your operations, determine where that most strategic place would be that gives easy access and that's safe to operate out of. And then identify a post-storm relief team, if possible. You know, if you have enough volunteers to assist, it may be important to split that team so that once you are in your recovery stage, you have a relief team that can come in that's refreshed to assist further with reopening your resort. Now, during the storm, this is the wait period, and to be honest, it's not a whole lot. You're waiting to react to things that could happen, and you're praying that nothing does happen. But employees should monitor conditions from a safe location. You don't want persons moving about. You know, if you can bring everyone into one central location, that's important, and you just monitor what's happening so you know how you can mobilize. So if there's an impact in a particular area that you're aware of, you can begin the planning process during the storm on how you're going to mobilize to deal with it once the all clear has been given. Operations stay in constant communications with the Hurricane Emergency Response Plan Crisis Management Team leaders. Those individuals that are identified in each area are getting information from the field, so to speak, into and on up to the crisis manager. Okay? You should also stay as much as you can in constant communications with your government agencies and your Ministry of Tourism offices, airlines, transportation, the ports, etc. Because as you come out of the storm, you need to know exactly what the conditions are. In the case of where this resort sits, it sits connected by bridge to a mainland, and our associates may be impacted, roads may be impacted, services may be impacted, and we may not be. Okay? So we want to make sure that you stay in constant communications with those different agencies. And then identify any service limitations as a result of the limitations in advance. Have a documented work around for those. So if you know of some limitations that could occur as a result of an event, have a workaround, a set plan of workarounds. Try not to do that on the fly. Do as much planning in advance as you can. If you know an area is going to get cut off or a service is going to not be available, what is your second backup? If you don't have a reservation system and you need to book, how do you go to the manual process? And make sure you test that. And then make sure you have a method of mobilizing teams quickly in case of a response. You may have an area where you have a breach, you have a window blowout, etc. Make sure you know how to activate persons to deal with that safely, persons to manage maybe crowd control, persons that will be responsible for cleanup, supplies being readily available to do repairs if needed. I want to talk a little bit about evacuation and sheltering, and I realize that this may not be affecting everyone that's on the call, but it's important to identify a safe location for both your employees and your guests. In some cases, they may be together. In some cases, they may be separate, depending on your size as well. But how do you get those persons to a sheltering situation, whether it be a floor evacuation, and when do you do it? If you have key access that are from exterior, you may need to move those persons in advance because of the deteriorating weather conditions. And so you may be doing some of these activities at a warning level. At our resort, we do that. In certain towers, we have to bring in because they're not attached internally. They're separate, and so we may be making some action steps before. If it's a building evacuation, have a plan on how you will bring those persons down. If it's a multi-story building, certainly if it's an office evacuation, know how you're going to close down offices and bring those personnel in as well. Review your organization policies on compensation and rate in advance as well. If you're going to compensate volunteers or if there is a cutoff point, make sure that's clear and clearly communicated. Make sure that you also have a registration process as well as its clear instructions to your guests on evacuation. It's important that you have a documented, auditable registration guest log as well as employee log, so you know who is actually there and everybody's accounted for. Ensure that shelters are comfortable as possible. Sometimes these storms, the severe part of the storm happens in the daytime. Sometimes it happens in the evenings. You just don't know. But you want to make it as comfortable as possible for everyone because you're going to be keeping a grouping of persons in one restricted area for sometimes 24 or even 48 hours, and it could even go longer depending on the impact. Again, I talked about establishing a registration and check-in and staging process and procedures. Make sure all guests and employees are registered and accounted for. And then clearly communicate what you can and cannot do in a shelter, because you don't want, this is a confined space and you need to respect the environment. So there's some things that you may allow to happen, alcohol to be served, etc. If there was not a hurricane event, there's some things that you may want to restrict. After the storm, of course, number one, safety is the priority. You need to assess all the damages that have happened. Have a team of individuals that are qualified to go out and do a damage assessment. This should include damages to critical infrastructure, to the building envelope itself, to your systems, electrical systems, water pump systems, storage, fuel supplies, telecommunications, etc. And then you want to resist giving the all clear too soon. it's always common, that the storm has passed, the eye has passed, the back end of the storm has passed, and everybody wants to get back into the operation. But it is important to resist doing that prematurely, because you can create other emergencies if you do. And then one other thing I put in here is personal issues. Remember that persons, employees, and your guests have actually gone through a lot of stress with this event, either personally at home or on property. And they, sometimes this doesn't resonate with them until after the storm. And so look for people being abnormally or overly angry and melancholy, or even slipping into some depression. That's important. Human capital is very important. Just a couple of documents or information of forms. I don't have examples of all of these, but if you change your plan, have a documented log on how you're changing your plan. Also, in your evacuation, registration, and relocation, I would suggest that you actually come up with a registration process where you can capture all the information. And then pre-storm assessments and damage assessments. And so I put a pre-storm assessment document. You can customize these to fit your establishment or your resort. But look at, what are you going to be checking, and how you're going to action corrective items to mitigate or prevent issues on your roof, in your emergency systems, etc. Okay? And these are just some tips. I could send this sample. There's several that are on the internet. But what's important is that you look at your situation and your facility and your staff complement, and you develop these checklists. Of course, have a systematic format for damage assessment as well. This is extremely important for insurers. If you can also complement this with pictures and images, it's going to help, as the adjusters may come out, or how you're going to be able to request assistance, even at the government level. So make sure that you have a document that speaks to damage assessment and how you're going to gather that information, and then make sure the persons that are doing it also know how to gauge what is no damage and what is minor damage or minimum cleanup mean, all the way up to the building is unsafe, structural damage. Okay, I think that's all that I had. This is my contact information. I hope this was helpful for everyone. Certainly, you're more than welcome to reach out. I actually will be at the Chiefs event on the 24th on a similar topic, and so certainly if you're attending that, I'd be happy to sit down and talk with you there as well. And I want to thank the Caribbean Hotel Association and also Adriana and Frank for inviting me to put on this webinar today, and I hope again that it was helpful.
Thank you so much. It was great. It was a lot of great information, and I'm getting tons of feedback on the chat box, particularly about those forms. A lot of people would love to have the checklist and those assessment forms. So maybe we could send those to them along with the copy of the webinar.
Yeah, I will send you those two particular forms. I'll send them to you on email if you want, and then you can distribute them.
Beautiful. Okay, and a lot of people are asking, they want to get a copy of this, of this webinar, and you might have joined us a little bit late, but I said that at the beginning of the webinar. You will all get a copy of the recording of Kevon's presentation, as well as his contact information, and now he will also provide us with the forms. So don't worry, you'll get that in your inbox shortly. But we do have a few questions. So as you had mentioned, and go ahead, keep sending your questions via the chat box, and I'll read them all off. The first question is, communication is, of course, critical, as you mentioned in your presentation. And while some of our employees will be working with you during the storm, communication infrastructure is super important. What is the best way to go about what do you need to know to make sure that you have in advance some form of backup messaging for your team in case the main forms are no longer available?
Okay. Well, in our case, we have a variety of different communication tools, obviously. So we depend on our internal IT network system to communicate. We have message boards. We can do voice blasts. We communicate to guests in a variety of mediums as well. TV networks, voice blasts to rooms. You can also, if you have a fire alarm system and it has a paging feature, or you may want to consider adding a paging feature in case you need to broadcast a message throughout. That is a possibility. Satellite phones. We actually do have satellite phones in case, but cellular networks, any form of communication, but it's better to have more than not. I mean, because you just don't know what system could go down. Radio systems, if a radio system doesn't work, you may have to go to a mobile network. If the mobile network doesn't work, then you're stuck at maybe a landline communication. And then you can establish briefings as well. Bring everybody together at certain times. And this is why it's important to have an emergency operating center and have the crisis management team and the crisis manager set up those parameters. If this happens and we lose communications, particularly if you have a facility that is spread out, every hour you're to come to this information and look at this whiteboard and get the latest information to be communicated out. So I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent answer. I mean, I think that also what about reaching out to your community overall? Because there are some, for example, I know that, which is one of the roles that CHTA plays for the hospitality industry. We like to get this information out there in advance to hurricane season as much as possible. So we put out a lot of information for you to be prepared, and this is just one of them. We have a hurricane plan checklist. We also have an insurance checklist and all of those things. And your local National Hotel Association, I'm sure, is also a wealth of information and local contacts. So what about reaching out to other community organizations in preparation for a storm?
Well, one thing that we could actually establish, I'm not sure that is, and I think at least here in the Bahamas, and I'm sure around the world, everyone's going to messenger type systems. I think most people are familiar with WhatsApp. So perhaps there is a WhatsApp chat group that's established across the region, because certainly when there's a storm traveling, there's a few websites that I might be looking at to understand, okay, well, what's happening in Antigua or what's happening, in Hispaniola or wherever, so that I understand what the impact could be here if the storm reaches to us. But there could also be an established chat group or message board type of feature.
Well, that actually exists. Yeah, we have, CHTA has a group, WhatsApp group with all of our NHTA presidents. So that was actually, WhatsApp was one of the most useful tools that we had during this past 2017 hurricane season, where it was the quickest way to get updates and throughout the region. And that's why it's also very important, I think we need to establish for hotels locally to reach out to their local NHTAs, your National Hotel and Tourism Associations, and keep in touch with them, know who their emergency preparedness person is, and establish a network so that you're not alone, and you are never alone in these kinds of emergencies. That's one of the things that surprised me so much going through the 2017 hurricane season, is that there's thousands of people out there working for you that you will never meet, but that are supporting you and giving their best for you while you're going through it. So I think that's very important. All right, so you have another question here. As far as evacuation, how do you determine how do you make that call of when to move people or not to move, when to evacuate or not to evacuate? That is the question.
Yeah, that is the question.
Yeah.
You have to, there's a lot of factors in there. Obviously, one is safety. If you're going to imminently end up in an unsafe condition to evacuate, you err on the side of caution of safety. Also, I mean, every location has to consider what the business continuity impacts are. And then if you're evacuating, your guests, their availability to actually leave the resort and maybe even leave the island. That's something that we have to be aware of and calculate as well. So we rely a lot on the information from the airlines, what the airport's going to be doing, what is going to be the impact in certain areas of our resort. As I said, we have some detached buildings that we which shelter persons in our contiguous building. And so those areas we start to evacuate in advance, probably at the tropical storm level, before the tropical storm level, because of the conditions and trying to bust them into where we're going to be. Now, we may not take them into shelter scenarios. We may not fully go into hurricane mode, but we would evacuate them into guest rooms into our contiguous property. So each case is going to be a little bit uniquely different. It's not an exact science. Each storm is a little different, and this is why it's important to have the crisis management team so you have constant feedback and then to be in communication with what's happening in your region with your government agencies, et cetera.
Okay. And okay, we have another question here that says, what is your view on security agents' role as part of an emergency plan?
Crowd control, monitoring the space, locking down your facility if you have to, if your policy calls for actually hard keying or locking, guest rooms and ensuring that you're doing sweeps. Like I said, the size of your resort may dictate how much security impact you need. I mean, I think in our case, security is probably maybe the second to the third largest group of individuals volunteering, but it's because we have kind of multi-story high-rise and a lot of areas that we need to make sure there aren't persons or situations that could create a security breach.
Okay. Looting is also a scenario that we discussed in the prior webinar.
Right.
It was also an insurance concern because folks were concerned whether it was covered.
Right.
Looting versus theft and things like that. So if you're interested in learning more about the insurance aspect of this conversation, the other webinar is up on our website right now. Okay, let's see. We have one more question. Do you have any knowledge of how, I'm so sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Do you have any knowledge of how much their support, meaning security agents, helps or hinders control and coordination during or after the storm?
After the storm?
The hindrance, or is it an aid?
I mean, in my case, I think they are very vital and very beneficial. I don't think they hinder us at all. And are you referring to external or internal security?
That's a good question. If you
maybe
guys
I'm not.
Yeah, if we need that clarification, if you could type that in, because I didn't include that in there. There we go. External communication.
External security.
Yeah,
I've not had any issues. I've not seen any hindrance to them. I think external security would align themselves with what is the overall objective of the region or the country or tourism itself. In our case, I think many of our destination or resorts or accommodation system is number one. So everybody's objective is to try as safely and as quickly as possible to bring things back to normalcy. And so I haven't experienced where it has been a negative or restrictive impact, at least not unnecessarily.
Okay. All righty. So do we have any more questions? I think we've answered everything. Does anyone have any more questions? You can raise your hand. All right. So no problem then. So I thank you again, Kevin, for joining us, for doing this for us. We greatly appreciate it, and it's great to have the feedback from someone that's been through it and that's, you know, working in a property and understands the struggle that these hoteliers go through. So thank you so much.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And let's hope we have a quiet season.
Oh yeah, let's hope so. So everyone, we will see you in the next webinar. Hopefully we'll see some of you or all of you at Chief in a couple of weeks. Oh my goodness, yeah, in like a week and a half. And so much for joining us. Have a great day, and we will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.